Thank you to Mejor Ciudad for inviting me. I'm very happy to be in Mexico. I apologize, my Spanish is dreadful, so I will speak in English. This morning, if you can put up the slides, I'm going to talk about building back a better city and lessons from recovery in other countries. This is a subject very dear to my heart and one in which I have a good amount of experience. So let me talk first, very briefly, about the concept of urban resilience. What does this buzzword mean? Second, some lessons from recovery in other countries. Third, some implications for building design and urban planning. And fourth, some lessons and challenges for Mexico City. The concept of resilience is really a very simple one, illustrated in this diagram. It is to limit the amount of losses or damage in any kind of disaster event and to reduce the amount of time it takes to recover. So you have an event that starts, you lose function in buildings, you lose some buildings themselves, and then you have to come back. If we can shorten that, it makes it a more easy city. So the definition, which is used by the Rockefeller Foundation, and I will repeat here, is simply the capacity for communities to survive, adapt, and grow, no matter what kind of chronic stress or acute shock they experience. So it is about being prepared, but it is about being a better city. Our cities, this is not, the animation isn't working, okay? Well, never mind. Let's see if I can go, no? Okay, the animation isn't working. This was gonna show you that in the animation, how a city starts with all the pipes and that when we build, we have things underground that we never see. And then we have the development of streets and blocks and housing and offices and factories and transportation. All of these things are what we call the critical infrastructure. They're the physical infrastructure of a city. The buildings, the water, the electricity, the gas, the phones. For architects, planners, engineers, these are the things that we pay attention to. But a city is more than that. It has necessary systems. It has healthcare. It has transportation, it has schools, it has supply chains, it has construction, it has banks, it has finance. These systems are really part of the urban system, and you can't function as a city without those things. So when we talk about lessons from disaster recovery, we have to think, and we talk about resilience, it has to include both the physical and those supportive systems. So when we learn from other disasters, well, what happens is quite straightforward. People are displaced, government and social services are disrupted, infrastructure is damaged, and if you see this chart, the engineers look at the buildings and say, well, how many of them can we not use, either because they're very dangerous in red, or we think they're dangerous, so we mark them yellow, and we think they're structurally okay, so we mark them green. But the people, what do the people of the city see? They see that half of their buildings that were damaged, were affected, aren't usable. And maybe less than half, because some of those that even seem okay are so messed up inside that they can't use them. So for people, it's a very different experience than for the construction and planning and engineering community, who are sort of tending to the buildings and infrastructure. And so in recovery, we have to do the repair and rebuilding of all of those physical parts. But we also have to rebuild the economy and the businesses, the government services, the jobs, all the schools, the healthcare. It's really two parts. It's a reconstruction, but it's also a social renewal. And you have to do these things together. Successful recovery, then, how do we define it? Again, the two parts. For the physical side, you need some good economic conditions. It's much harder to rebuild if the economy is in a slump. You need good entrepreneurship, you need good developers and business people, you need available capital, you need very predictable and functional government processes, and you need some very dependable government assistance, particularly for housing. On the social side, you really need transparent government processes, you need citizen involvement in planning, you need an emphasis on renewal, not just replacement of what is there, and you need some adaptation for the future so that you're better prepared. So it's those combination of things that make things successful. So let me give a few examples, and let me start with Christchurch. My colleague from Wellington is here. He'll criticize me if I say something wrong, but there was a sequence of earthquakes that hit Christchurch, New Zealand, starting in 2010, but the most impactful happened on February 22nd, 2011. The epicenter was right under the downtown. The losses in dollar value for the country were huge. It was 20% of the national gross domestic product. New Zealanders are very well insured, mostly by government decree, and the insurance helped finance the recovery, but it'll still be a 10 to 20 year process, and let me explain why. In part, the downtown was severely damaged. This is, oh, again, my slides aren't working. There was it's dropped the animations. There was a photograph before the earthquake, during the earthquake. This is a photograph of the downtown after the earthquake. It was about 270 hectares, a mile square, that was cordoned off, closed for 2 years. And again, oh, I'm really sorry, I should have checked these slides. They're not working. About 1,800 buildings were demolished. There was essentially the loss of the entire downtown. In that downtown, there were about 6,000 companies with 50,000 jobs. In the immediate aftermath, of course, there was a significant amount of unemployment. Now, some of that has come back by people moving to the suburbs. But there was also a huge amount of damage in homes. 87% of the homes had some damage, about 30% of those quite significant. And there was severe liquefaction throughout the residential areas. There were rock falls and cliffs falling. And yet the losses, by technical standards, we considered typical. It was about 50% of the value was residential, about 25% commercial, about 25% government and infrastructure. But it required a huge amount of infrastructure replacement in the whole city. It required the planning of a new central business district, zoning of land use, etc. So it is a very difficult, time-consuming urban process. Now, the social capital really made a difference. I talked about sort of the social importance. The citizens of Christchurch were very loyal to their city. They organized in churches, they organized art events, they organized music events, they used vacant lots for concerts. All of these things really contributed to a kind of a sense of community and a willingness to recover. But the attitudes are really changing. Initially, there was a large plan to sort of rebuild the downtown with a green and sustainable city. It was met with a lot of skepticism. But as the growth, as the businesses relocated out to the suburbs, there was traffic, but there were also floods, there were fires, there were more earthquakes, there were more disasters. And that began to influence people's attitudes. And there's some recent research by colleagues at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch that says that the common views on building codes are really changing. People are not satisfied with just a life safety building code. They really want to see higher standards. And tenants who are renting in downtown buildings are expecting to have those standards. They won't rent. And so you see the signs on real estate advertising the structural system of the building, advertising that this is a low damage building. So there's a recognition of what their experience has really increased the citizens' knowledge and made them better consumers, and has really contributed a great deal to how the city is going to grow and change over time. But reconstruction speed is never fast at the best of times, but it is the more disruption to very complex urban systems, a whole downtown, an infrastructure system, it takes longer. So we have a few examples in which we rebuilt very quickly after the Northridge earthquake in Los Angeles, in China, in Chile, but those were more about construction of buildings. And the other examples, from Japan to New Orleans to Christchurch to Tohoku, Hurricane Sandy in New York, or even Haiti, these are going to take decades. And this, because there are so many complex systems involved. So if you ask what was the experience in Christchurch different, yes, from those first three, but more like everyone else. So let's look at some of those cases and what they can offer as lessons from resilience. First, I'll quickly discuss the first three because they're interesting cases. The Northridge earthquake in 1994 had a very similar profile in the sense, I mean, it's a much bigger city, but in terms of the 50% of the damage was residential, 20% commercial, the rest sort of government buildings and infrastructure. There was a very good construction program for the rebuilding of the damage to the public buildings, the city hall, the libraries, and there was a housing program. There were about 15 neighborhoods that were designated ghost towns because the housing was so badly damaged. It took about 4 years to reconstruct that housing with a lot of intervention and with government assistance at the level of the city. But it really wasn't until 20 years later, until the last couple of years, that they really began to do some resilience planning. So it was a gap between when they had the earthquake and they sort of did construction and stopped. They were fine. And now they're thinking much harder about the future. In China, it was a very large earthquake in Wenchuan in 2008. There was sadly a huge number of deaths, more than 90,000. 5 million people were homeless. The government did actually a Herculean effort at immediate assistance. They were very involved in directly financing the reconstruction. The government built schools and hospitals, and they did a very clever tax on the eastern provinces, 1% of their gross domestic product for 4 years to finance the construction. But an interesting lesson from there is that they twinned the cities from the east to the cities who are experiencing the damage. It meant that no one was overlooked. So everyone didn't go work in one place and ignore the other communities. So there was a nice balance of the distribution of the aid. But unfortunately, China likes to do things very fast. And they like to do it very top down. And so they really had some problems in with construction standards, with the sites they chose to place the housing on. Now, understandably, they had a lot of people in temporary camps in the mountains, and they wanted to get people out of those dreadful conditions in the snow. But they built the housing so quickly with no consultation of the local communities. The housing was so far away from where people's jobs were that often you only saw women and children in that housing, and everyone else was somewhere else to work because it just didn't work for them. So going too fast is not always the right solution. In Chile, in February 2010, Again, a very large earthquake, again, about 20% of the national gross domestic product. In this case, Chile, which I think if my colleagues will accept this, because the minister tells me this all the time, it is the most developed of the developing countries. And they understood that they had a social commitment to housing, and they felt that the earthquake really set their housing program back many years. So they really focused on government funding of the reconstruction. All the infrastructure and public facilities are 100% funded by government. Of the 370,000 housing units, 60%, mostly the affordable housing, was funded by the government. All of this through a 4-year tax on the mining industry. So through unaffected industries, essentially. And it was an amazing effort at standards set at the national level, but local efforts, local contractors, local regional administration of the programs to get all of this construction done in a 4-year period. But I think in the process of getting everyone rehoused, they recognized that they didn't really focus very much on the economic and the social side, and really compliments to the Rockefeller program at Harvard University, the Recuperación effort post-rebuilding, and really the government and a lot of the design schools have gotten involved in this, trying to help with economic planning, social planning, more citizen involvement in planning. And I think that these efforts are ongoing now in Chile and part of the larger disaster planning that takes place as they continue to have earthquakes and floods and other kinds of disasters. Now, let's look at the other side. Those were the ones who constructed quickly, some more successful than others. But the majority have a somewhat different story. In my own city in San Francisco, what's called the Loma Prieta earthquake of 1989, it was a relatively small earthquake in terms of the amount of dollar value. And it was heavily damaged infrastructure, freeways, roads, not that much housing, not that much public-private buildings, but it was a very long-term reconstruction project, really about 15 to 25 years. And it took about 10 years just to repair the affordable housing, the expensive market rate housing was built within about 2 years, but we lost a lot of housing for low-income people. And that really took about 10 years, and we really only ever rebuilt about 75%. It was a very hard process. There was very little funding. Wait, I skipped a slide. And the infrastructure and the civic projects, and this is a case where taking the time to plan really makes a difference. One of the things that happened in San Francisco was a huge planning process and a discussion about removing those damaged double-decker freeways that ran all along the waterfront and creating a much more beautiful, much more publicly oriented waterfront. And that process took a lot of time. It took a lot of time to repair the museums that were damaged. They were all done to the city halls, all done to a very high standard so they can be usable. They all have base isolated systems, so they will be functional after an earthquake. But the reimagining of the public space in the city took a great deal of time and a great deal of planning, but I think we have a much more beautiful and a much better city as a result of that. And there has been a number of city efforts in the last decade that have really focused on resilience planning, some of it creating models of what the losses would be in different earthquake scenarios, what kind of planning do we need to go forward. But there's an organization called SPUR that's been around for over 100 years. It's the grandparent of Mejor Ciudad, I think, and they will have to get to know them better. They did, starting in 2007, an initiative on resilience, and one of all of this is available on the web, so people can look it up, just spur.org, was a decision that for us, so bounded by water on three sides, such a high technology economy, many apartments, that shelter was really important, housing was really important. And we decided in this organization, which was made up, like Mejor Ciudad, of developers and business people and lawyers and government officials and citizens and academics, the goal was set that that 95% of our housing should be strong enough so that people can stay in their homes in a magnitude 7.2 earthquake. Not in the most extreme, but in a design earthquake. And that led to some legislation about things that we needed to do to improve some existing buildings. But this process of the civic conversation was incredibly important for the city, and it really has changed the laws. And in fact, this is the model that Los Angeles has followed in creating their own resilience plan. An example that is less successful, I think, is the damage to New Orleans from Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Huge numbers of losses of housing units, over 100,000 units. 80% of the residents were evacuated at the time of the hurricane. Oops, too fast. Okay, within, oh my goodness. All right, within 10 years, the levees were rebuilt. That was a federal program that were lost in the flood. The downtown was revitalized, and the tourists began to return. But we still have an enormous housing problem in New Orleans and in the Gulf Coast. It took also, there was not enough civic involvement at the beginning. There were 2 failed plans that were government-imposed top-down plans, and it wasn't until 3 or 4 years later the Unified New Orleans Plan really involved the citizenry, and it was done locally by local people, that they began to really do more strong neighborhood planning and some social organization. It is really they have a long way to go for housing recovery. They are still having very serious housing problems now 12, 15 years later. So recovery is something, we see that, and initially I showed that slide that was a single line of, this is what resilience means. But in fact, recovery happens over time in different ways. So businesses may recover at a different rate than housing, at a different rate than some social institutions or schools. So we have to really think about which of these things are critical to our city's ability to function, and which things do we really want to make stronger so that we survive better? Which things do we not want to have a long time to have a recovery process? So it's part of the planning. So essentially, just to reiterate, it's a combination, again, of the redesign and then the regeneration of all of the social and economic components, okay? So I'm very quickly going to go through this section because the implications for planning and building is a more technical conversation, but people think if you build to the building code, it's earthquake resistant, but really, we think that, but really people want it to be earthquake proof, and it's not. So, oh my goodness, what happened? What's going on with this machine? It doesn't want me to talk about this. Oh my goodness. How do I get this to work? I'm really having trouble with this machine. So we really have, we need to think about low technology construction, low damage construction. Sorry, I got rattled by the machine. And we need to actually think beyond the building. Instead of just thinking about how do we design a building to perform well, make a hospital safe, make a school safe, make the Apple headquarters safe, it doesn't do any good if they can work in the Apple headquarters, but the people who work there have no housing, right? It doesn't help them. So we have to think about all of those systems and plan for those systems. And we can measure these systems. We can say, well, as we did in San Francisco, how much of our housing do we really want to function after an earthquake, and what's it going to take to get to that goal in 20 or 30 years? We can look at land use planning and do a better job of using land use planning, tying the hazards to the parcels so that we get a much better understanding of what is required for that, and whether or not it's really buildable. We have to pay attention to ecological sustainability. We can't do without that. And there's an example from Christchurch where they had so much geotechnical data after the Christchurch earthquake that they created different zones that required different foundation requirements. And you simply went online and typed in the address, and you could see exactly what the soil conditions were at that site and what was required as part of the reconstruction. And also, of course, for infrastructure, these are images from New York and from Sandy, but we want to replace the infrastructure better. And let me give an example. The plan in Los Angeles, water comes and crosses the fault. All their water comes from somewhere else. So they have to make sure that the pipes don't break when they cross a fault line. But they also want to improve the way the distribution system works, but over time as part of the natural maintenance. And they also want to have better sources. So instead of all the water coming out of the mountains, so let's have conservation, let's have water recycling, let's have some desalinization. If we improve all of the ways that we get water, we can grow as a city with or without an earthquake, but we will be more resilient, and that's important. This is an example from Nepal in which a student actually modeled how informal construction becomes more valuable as it gets bigger. The more stories you add to it, it becomes more vulnerable. And the importance here is that he combined urban growth models with these hazard and vulnerability models, and I won't spend a lot of time on that, but the conclusion is what's important, that in just helping to make self-built housing safer, you can reduce the risk by about 20% in 15 years. This is an important lesson for every city that is dealing with informal housing construction. And I think we need to think about how we train, how people learn about construction so that they can get some lessons on how to build more safely. So last two slides, six quick lessons for successful recovery and then for resilience. First of all, housing is absolutely essential to recovery. You can't recover if you can't rebuild your housing. Government leadership and communication with the communities is very important. Existing programs are easier to use. You don't have to create a new bureaucracy. But going fast shouldn't be the only criteria. It's important to manage information. You have to communicate with the citizens all the time. And recovery should enable citizens, not create entitlements. This isn't about an expectation of just a handout, but it is about, yes, you will be helped, and yes, we want you to do some of your own preparations. We want to make sure that your children know that you know how to act in a disaster, that your children know what to do. And finally, some lessons on resilience. Sometimes these big planning exercises seem overwhelming. I think it doesn't have to be complicated. You have to do what is good and simple and implementable. Don't try to do everything at once. I think it is critically important to improve building standards and metrics for enforcement. You have to develop, or you have to have metrics for the urban systems. You have to say, how many of my schools should be operational after some kind of an event? How many hospitals do we actually have to have functioning? How much of our housing so we don't collapse? We have to link the economics, the hazards, the social components, and we really have to use land use. It is much easier to regulate at the front end than after the fact. And we have to develop a culture of understanding amongst our citizens. We cannot be oblivious to the fact that we live in these beautiful places, but we also live with hazards. And finally, we have to think long range. It is really important that these are 30-year and 50-year plans. We will do things incrementally, and we will make things happen. So, in final conclusion, resilience integrates across all of these systems. It integrates across disciplines, and it's very adaptable over time. And I think they've just cut me off. That was it. Thank you very much.